Hello and welcome back to NoBS. Today we return to talking about a certain board game that's removing some factors to its game in order to try and appease woke activists who weren't even really attacking the game in the first place. I'm of course today talking about Dungeons and Dragons, this long-running board game that's been adapted to many other games too. It's turned into different things like card games, video games, movies, shows, stuff like that. Like this is a very popular series that has been going on for many decades. I remember them playing this on that Stranger Things show that was set in the 80s, and I believe the game was around before that too. Essentially, a tabletop board game is what we're talking about. It's a game where you lay out a board, pick up some pieces with your friends. They usually involve like rolling dice, having some kinds of strategies. You create a character too. Sometimes you play cards along with that, and different kind of styles like that. I'm not super familiar with them much anymore. I did play a lot of games when I was a kid. I typically played other kinds of common board games like a Monopoly or a Scrabble or stuff like that, but this is like a more intricate like tabletop game is what they call it. And essentially they're removing a certain kind of character and they're removing the score modifiers because they kind of think they're racist now. It's a little ridiculous. It's a little like hard to grasp because in addition, like no one really cared about this. Like there was not a lot of people clamoring saying this game was negative. They kind of did a preemptive change on their own. And I think it's part of them trying to get some relevance, trying to get some, press and notoriety. A lot of reasons these companies go woke these days and tell everyone about it is to try to get attention and to sell. So I think that's a big part of it too. And it's just unnecessary change. Essentially, there's a lot of like classes of characters. You could pick different types of characters. Like you could pick a human, a witch, you could pick this kind of monster character, this kind of character. And they're kind of limiting that some because they say it might be racist if you pick this character based on their race, and their race could be something like an orc. The orc is kind of the one that's getting into trouble here. That's also a kind of character that's from like Lord of the Rings and other mystical kind of properties. And we're going to talk about why they're removing that, why it's silly, and get into all this right away. So first, let's jump to this tweet. It says here, Dungeons and Dragons officially removes negative racial ability score modifiers from rules. This is from a comicbook.com article. There's the character. And they're like saying here, like this tweet says, it's like, we're really doing this with fantasy characters? This is pretty bourgeois radicalism. Put a lemur and a gorilla side by side and tell me one is not physically stronger than the other. That's essentially what those are about. It's also about deciding the weaknesses and strengths when picking what you want to play and things your character might have to overcome. So this guy's given a pretty good explanation. I think that's a good way to look at it. When you have two characters with different builds, like these orc characters tend to be like huge and strong, and they're kind of like these kinds of monster-like characters almost, like I said. So they're going to have strength like advantages, but they'll also maybe have like a disadvantage to something else like magic, or they probably move slower than like a smaller character, like say you're a small character who shoots a bow and arrow, and you might have not a lot of defense, not a lot of strength, but you can move fast and shoot them from far away. I'm just giving a random example. This guy gives an example of animals, like putting a lemur by a gorilla. You could also say like a bear compared to a squirrel. You see a smaller animal and it's going to have those kinds of advantages. Like I said, the squirrel would be like archer who shoots from far away, who's small, doesn't have a lot of defense. The bear is like stronger, it has a strength, and it can't move as fast. It has disadvantages too. And that's really what people are getting upset about. They're trying to like say this has something to do with the real world. They're trying to say it's like racist to like give certain characters more advantages, but it's like, no, this is just a game. This is not about real world stuff. This is a fantasy world based on like wizards and monsters. So the fact they're changing this and trying to get like bonus points for it, like they want a medal or something, it really shows that they're in this for the wrong reasons. They're having the wrong mindset. They're not thinking clearly and giving this story like proper coverage. I mean, people going along with it, it seems like the comic book article is against it. And the only other thing I'll mention is this kind of picture. This is what it kind of looks like to me. It's a meme. It says D&D is getting rid of the concept of evil races. Orcs aren't inherently evil, just like you guys. Wait, you think I look like an orc? So yeah, it's kind of like showing the kind of hypocrisy. Like they're trying to protect, like they're comparing the orcs to like black people in some way. Like I don't see it. I don't know what they're going with that. If they think they're like a comparison to like people from Africa or something like that, but it kind of makes you think that meme might be a little true. Like they're trying to protect black people. That's a typical kind of liberal tactic. They're always trying to defend them at all costs. They just think they're always the heroes for black people, but sometimes that is turning them into like a racist. It makes them look a little weird when they're like defending them so much, and sometimes they go out of their way to defend them, and it's just like, whoa, you went a little too far. Now you seem racist. This seems bad on you. And I could see that that coming out of this story for sure. So let's go ahead and read more into this article and see what the details are. I already said the title, it removed the modifiers. Let's see what the article says itself. Dungeons and Dragons players will no longer have a negative ability score modifier when building a character of a certain race. Last week, Dungeons and Dragons officially released updated errata for a number of their source books and adventures. The Volos Guide to Monsters errata was particularly important in that it removed the negative ability score modifiers for playable kobolds and orcs. While kobolds originally had a -2 modifier to their strength score and orcs had a -2 to their intelligence, the updated rules remove those modifiers entirely from the game. Additionally, the errata also removes the orc's menacing trait with the primal intuition trait, which grants players proficiency in 2 of the following options: animal handling, insight, intimidation, medicine, nature, perception, and survival. So I think this is back to that meme, like it's like they're trying to protect this race. They don't want to give them any kind of negative score, just like with this kobolds race as well. And it just doesn't make sense. Like, people have to have positives and negatives. Like, that's what makes games interesting. You got to have trade-offs to help you decide, you know, who is better fitting for that position or who's better fitting for your play style. And that's what makes it interesting. That's why these RPGs are fun, and they could be very complex too. So to remove that ability, I don't know how big this is going to affect things, but I predict this is going to be a pretty big game changer. Like, removing their negative effects is going to be like, hey, now more people are going to pick these characters, and they're going to be possibly overpowered and unbalanced. And I don't know, there could be like a landmark where it's like before and after this change, the game really had different, you know, changed for the worse or for the better. It could be better too, but you know, there could be people that don't want this change or want to play by the old rules. I'm not sure how all that stuff works. I need more details on Dungeons and Dragons, but I think the main point is like, yeah, this game is cool. It's legendary. You know, it may not be for everyone. I'm certainly not a super fan or anything. I just know tertiary knowledge about it. But the other thing is, it's like, why even do this change? There's no one asking for this. No one was offended by this. No one even really thinks about Dungeons and Dragons much anymore. It's been out for many decades. I'm sure there are a lot of good fans out there for it, but it's not like this groundbreaking, like, oh, this big, like, controversial thing. It didn't even come up. They're like preemptively changing this to try and get attention. The updated rules reflect previous comments by the D&D team that promised better representation and a movement towards giving the player characters individualism as opposed to forcing them to fit within cultural stereotypes within the game's lore. While players can still choose to use the cultural generalities of D&D's various campaign settings when creating a character, the updated rules allows for greater expression and also gives DMs more freedom to create their own worlds where the standard D&D culture stereotypes aren't present. So they're talking about this culture and the stereotypes within the fantasy. I don't know if you can really call that like a negative stereotype or a cultural stereotype. I mean, I guess the word fits, but you can't use it the same way you're talking about real world stereotypes. Like, we're talking about a fantasy, we're talking about a fantasy world, we're talking about characters that are like monsters or aliens or from the hells, the depths of earth. You know, we're talking about magical beings, wizards and stuff. So to say, oh, you can't be racist to wizards, it sounds totally ridiculous. Like, trying to make these orcs more sympathetic is really strange. It actually reminds me of the movie. There was a Warcraft movie a few years back. I believe it was 2015 or 2016. And it was actually pretty good. It wasn't bad. It was fun. It had good graphics and a good kind of story, very action packed. But the funny part to me that this reminds me of is how they make the orcs and the evil characters like more sympathetic. They make them seem like they're not this kind of monster that they've been for so long, which admittedly makes a more interesting movie and it makes more like depth to the characters, but it's also just strange twist. And it just seems like they're trying to sympathize with these kinds of characters that were just typically like the monsters that you fight. You know, like the cool part about the orcs was the fact that they're so vicious and violent. And sometimes you pick them like you're picking the enemy. It's like picking the enemy in Star Wars. You'd be someone from the Empire. You'd be like Darth Vader or the Emperor or someone like evil. But what would happen if we're talking about that story, if we did this in that story, we would have to go down the road of the Empire did nothing wrong. They'd have to do this whole sympathizing thing with the Empire. And that's a whole other thing. I mean, the Empire has represented some other bad groups over the past. So it just is kind of ridiculous in a fantasy setting is what I'm getting at. In addition to removing the negative ability score modifiers, Dungeons and Dragons is also introducing a new set of alternative rules that give players the options of moving ability score modifiers to other ability scores to match a character's background. This opens the door for more non-traditional character builds such as an orc wizard or a halfling barbarian. This alternative rules will appear in the upcoming Tasha's Cauldron of Everything, which will be released later this year. You can check out all of the errata as well as the updated compendium of frequently asked questions on D&D's webpage. So there's a podcast on this channel too, but that basically gets to the point. I think you guys get it. It's just a board game trying to regain relevance, trying to kind of virtue signal to these other companies, to these other kinds of people out there saying, hey, we've got new rules, we've got this new woke system, and we're pushing it real hard. Like we were fearing before. We did a video about this before early on, but now it's kind of like gotten to the point where you're just like, okay, they're coddling minorities. They're also comparing the orcs to minorities in a lot of ways. Like they're saying orcs are like black people or something like that, which is obviously a bit offensive. I think super offensive when you say, oh, that reminds you of a black person. Like that's offensive on them. And it's like showing their bias and how bad this thing is getting on their side. And, you know, it's just kind of like the thing where it's like you try so hard to be anti-racist. At a certain point, you kind of become racist because you're just so obsessed with it, so obsessed with like treating certain ones better and making everyone feel happy. And it's like patronizing. It's like treating them like children. It's like, no, people don't care about the orcs. There's no similarity. Like people aren't thinking orcs are these certain kinds of people. It's just an absurd kind of like thinking from these people who are out in California or something, you know, these woke leftists that have this liberalism like poisoning their minds. So with that said, I think that about wraps things up. I hope you guys enjoyed today's video. Make sure you comment your thoughts on everything below. Have you heard of Dungeons and Dragons? Have you played before? Do you think these changes are a good idea or bad? Tell me what you think in the comments. Also subscribe if you're new. Hit the bell for notifications too. And until next time, have a great day and a pleasant tomorrow.